Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to Congressman Steve Israel to begin the program.
Well, Natalie, thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, to what I promise you will be an enjoyable and fun evening with, for my money, the preeminent contemporary political satirist, Christopher Buckley. I want to tell you that, remind you that this program is co-hosted by the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University and Chris Riback, who conducts various conversations. I'm going to brag about him in a moment. For those of you who are not aware, the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell, we exist to curate a program that deepens discourse and elevates understanding. And our guests have included the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and also, and I think Christopher Buckley will find this interesting, Reince Priebus, former Chief of Staff to President Trump, who gave us kind of the inside scoop on Christopher Buckley's book, having actually served as Chief of Staff to the President. We're very, very proud to partner with Chris Riback on these book conversations. Chris is a co-founder of Good Guys Media Ventures, and he is a good guy. His Political Wire podcasts rank #3 on iTunes News and Politics. And our joint ventures have included Jonathan Karl from ABC News talking about his book, Front Row at the Trump Show. Molly Ball was on recently talking about her excellent biography of Nancy Pelosi, aptly entitled Pelosi. And Gene Sperling talking to us about his book, Economic Dignity. If you want information, if you want to see recordings of those events or the other events that we feature, you can just go to iopga@cornell.edu. That's iopga at cornell.edu. Tonight, Christopher Buckley. He is somebody who has really influenced my own writing. I will tell you, I've done 2 political satires. Between Christopher Buckley and me, we've sold millions of copies of books. Me probably maybe 5,000, Christopher Buckley the balance. But one of the greatest days of my life, and I remember it so vividly, it was when I received an email from Christopher Buckley, who is my, I don't want to embarrass you too much, Chris, but just, you know, I idolized him. I voraciously read everything that he wrote. And he sent me an email telling me that he read my first book, and he said, I predict great things. And I saved that email, I copied it, I sent it to my mother, who said, well, maybe he predicts great things, but I'm not so sure. It was just a wonderful, wonderful message. He's the author of 18 books, including Thank You for Smoking, White House Mess, Washington Schlepped Here, Supreme Courtship, No Way to Treat a First Lady, Losing Mom and Pup. And Christopher, again, I just want to thank you for joining with us tonight. Thanks so much for being here.
Delighted to be here, Congressman, and delighted to be also with Chris. I would point out it's how ironic and what fun it is to find ourselves almost directly across from each other across Long Island Sound. You in Oyster Bay, and I in Stamford. Yeah, hands across the sound.
Hands across the sound.
As they would say.
We should debate as part of this conversation for the next hour who has the better pizza. I know, you know, people in Connecticut claim to have better pizza than Long Islanders. I'm very proud of my Long Island pizza.
I'd be very careful about starting that war. we got this is Connecticut, pal.
and I don't want to get in between you two great writers, but I'm from Chicago, and Chicago pizza wins. I'm very sorry.
You know, I was hoping that this was going to be an hour of comedy, and that's C-O-M-I-T. And here, you know, it breaks down within a minute. We are truly in the Trump era.
Lost all control. So for those of you who've not yet read the book, and I urge you to read it because it is just extraordinary. And during tough times, when you can't stand another bit of uncertain or bad news, it's nice to be able just to laugh. So get this book. But if you haven't yet read it, the book is about Herb Nutterman, who is the 7th Chief of Staff to President Trump, and the bizarre things that he did for the president, so bizarre that he's actually written it from prison. And it has kind of a strange Lovian quality to its intrigue. And I've got to say, I laughed out loud at some of the great comic gems. So let me just read a few of them, and then that will help us transition into our first question. Chris writes in the book, The Trump era has, quote, the Trump era has proved that Americans are capable of the most extraordinary moral elasticity. He writes, quote, I don't claim to be this is my favorite line, I don't claim to be a political savant, but inflicting an October surprise on yourself struck me as unorthodox. He writes about the president tweeting like a woodpecker on Adderall. Tweeting like a woodpecker on Adderall, so precious. But you also, Chris, you are an equal opportunity offender. You take on the left. You write that the Democratic vice presidential nominee running against President Trump, quote, there was good news that the nominee was, quote, getting traction among Midwestern women who belong to book clubs. And you say that the Democratic campaign had, quote, set aside their touchy-feely campaign theme, come on, America, we're so much better than this. Now, you come from a pretty conservative background. Your dad, William F. Buckley, you were the chief speechwriter for George H.W. Bush. You wrote for the Conservative National Review. So let's begin by asking, are you getting pushback from friends and family about writing a satire that really sharply pokes at President Trump?
Well, I don't seem to have any conservative friends anymore, so there's no one to push back. But I'm not sure I'm with you on the premise there, Steve.
Okay.
The embedded premise, I think, in your question being that President Trump is a conservative. I don't think President Trump is conservative. I don't think he's anything but his own ideology, with emphasis on the first two letters of the word ideology. Donald Trump is about Donald Trump, ultimately. He may do some conservative type things incidentally, and I would be almost certain when he does those, he's doing it for a reason that has nothing to do with the common weal or the greater good. So I would demur there. He's my dad. My late dad would have probably, he used a lot of Latin words. My dad. I grew up at a dinner table where, phrases like mutatis mutandis and pari passu and quod licet Jove, non licet bovi were sort of commonplace. But I think he would probably call Mr. Trump sui generis, his own genre. And with any luck, he's the only one of his type around still.
And you use that phrase sui generis in the book itself, I recall.
Does that occur in the book?
Sure does.
The character you just adduced, who in the book went to press in March. I didn't know who the Democrat. I was pretty sure who the presidential nominee was going to be, but I was kind of rooting for Amy Klobuchar, whom I have a platonic Jones for. I really like her, and so that's in the book. Trump refuses to call the Democrat nominee and vice president nominee by their names. He calls them only loser one and loser two. So loser two was modeled on Amy Klobuchar, who it turns out or will probably not be the nominee, and I'm sorry, but maybe 4 years from now.
Before I turn it over to Chris Riback, I have to ask, because I know Amy well and she appeared on one of our programs. Does she know that that character was modeled after her?
No, I don't. I don't think so. I want to send her a book, but I can report the book seems to be sold out. It's sort of good news. The good news is it's selling. The bad news is you can't buy it because they have run out. So I'm waiting. The second printing is due next week, and she's right at the top of my send to list. No, I have a lot of admiration for her. I don't hate politicians. Someone once said, you can't love democracy and hate politicians. And that's true. Although there certainly are some ones I like less. But I liked you from hello.
Thank you. Well, with your permission, I'm going to tell Amy that there's an allusion to her in the book. You talk about shifty Adam Schiff in the book, and I called him and said, guess what? You're in the Christopher Buckley book, which I handed to him just last Sunday. And he said his response was, well, that adds to the suspense. So
his response was probably, who's Christopher Buckley?
No, it was not. How about Christopher Riback?
He's here also, and it should be pointed out as evidence of your playfulness with language, which just is throughout the book, Chris, and it's fantastic. And in a moment, I'll tell you why I'm going to say it's fantastic. But that the vice presidential candidate loser two, so there's loser one, the presidential candidate. The vice presidential candidate loser two, of course, is TOO, not the number two.
Right.
So you wrote on page 104, and I feel that this was meant for how you wanted me to introduce my characterization of your book. So Mr. Trump had just given an idea, it didn't go over so well, that made him maybe not so happy, which you write, it was part and parcel perhaps of the proverbial loneliness of command. Churchill was this way. Stalin famously didn't like it when those around him failed to effuse over his ideas. Hitler could get very sulky if he felt that the Heil Hitlers were lacking in Sturm und Drang. From what the CIA told us, Kim Jong-un got extremely peevish if he detected diminuendo in the chorus of, let us eternally glorify the sacred revolutionary careers and immortal feats of the great comrade Kim Jong-un. So let me glorify the sacred revolutionary career and book of Christopher Buckley. It was great. I really liked it.
By the way, that's an actual North Korean slogan.
I'm sure.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
There was, totalitarian leaders, or otherwise known as dictators,
yeah,
tend to be long-winded. Fidel Castro was capable of giving State of the Union addresses that went on for 5, 6, even 7 hours. And there's about, I don't know if Stalin was quite that long-winded, but there's a sort of a story both amusing and chilling that after one speech he gave to, I guess, the Duma, or at the 23rd Soviet People's Congress of tractor makers. Of course, everyone stood up to applaud. And they kept applauding, and this went on for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Now it's 15 minutes. People are starting to sweat and get tired, and their hands are chapped. No one wanted to be the first to stop applauding, and this was apparently a very common. I'm sure this happens at Steve Israel's speeches.
Of course, all the time.
I mean, I once was the first to stop applauding, and oh boy, that was a very unpleasant evening.
Yeah.
He has some very faithful fans in Long Island.
So I want to applaud you, Chris, and ask you why you took on this challenge. You are a satirist. Steve characterized how wonderful of a satirist and all of the books that you've written, but how do you out-satire the reality that we are living through? How do you out-absurd the absurd?
It's a very good question. I actually gave up political satire some years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, right about 2015, I think it was. Gee, why would it be that year? On the grounds that American politics seemed to me to have arrived at a point of self-satire. I mean, it was like a self-cleaning oven. I wasn't really sure it needed embroidery by me, so I went off and wrote a couple of historical novels. One of them set in Steve's congressional district in the 1660s. And, you know, they sold okay, but they didn't knock Hillary Mantel off the mantelpiece. And so it seemed that that wasn't really what people wanted from me. And also people kept saying, you know, why aren't you writing about this? This is a garden, the Trump era is a garden of low-hanging fruit. You know, you hardly, you don't even break a sweat reaching for it. And the answer is, that's true, but it's simultaneously a low-hanging fruit and tricky, because I don't know how to say this without sounding as though I'm tooting my own horn, but if you're gonna do it, it's got to be good. Otherwise, it's just a pale imitation of an already tiresome reality. We do seem to be living in some kind of golden era of satire. Look at Stephen Colbert every night from his basement, where I think his show, for whatever it's worth, is even better from the basement. It's the interaction with his guests is somehow more intimate. But he's knocking it out of the park. Seth Meyers, this extraordinary woman, Sarah Cooper, this young lady of color who does these eerie lip syncings of Trump moments. She's pioneered a whole new field of satire. This may be known as the Sarah Cooper era. J.L. Colvin. I mean, it's being done a lot. Alec Baldwin, certainly memorably. I would point out that, you know, after one of Mr. Baldwin's more excoriating impersonations of Mr. Trump was, 15 minutes later, sitting perhaps, on a certain seat in the White House, tweeting that this was disgusting and it ought not to be allowed. It ought to be banned. I aspire to the day when my satire prompts a sitting US president to say that it ought not to be allowed and ought to be banned by the FCC.
Well, all you have to do is recite your work on TikTok.
I guess that might
your own TikTok channel. If I can just follow up really quickly, and then because I know Steve has a question as well, with the Sarah Coopers, with Colbert, with Trevor Noah releasing on YouTube, with TikTok, with Twitter, with humor coming at, it is a golden age of humor, and it comes at us in 60-second, maybe minute 30 bites. Were you worried at all that, since 2015, things had maybe changed and folks wouldn't have the patience for political satire that builds and builds and builds over 250 plus pages? Well, that's a bit the trick I find. This is my 19th book, and all I can say is it doesn't get any easier. And Steve's written a couple, and I doubt he would tell you that his second book was easier to write than the first. They just seem to get harder. Satire often starts by being a great idea, a great concept. And then you very often run into what's called Act 3 problems, where, okay, it's wow, this is great, it's very funny, it's uh-oh. So yeah, it's but the response so far, touch wood, is pretty good. I mean, I've had some reviews that have said this book is almost as good as a Steve Israel novel. So
wow.
That was
my mom.
That was the congressman's review.
Yeah, I just got on third base here. Steve does homers. I try to hit a double and then steal third.
Such fake news that we're hearing, ladies and gentlemen. Chris, let me ask you about your research for this book. You know, I've known several chiefs of staff to this president, and there have been several, and to other presidents. I had a conversation with one chief of staff in the Trump White House who said, you know, you liberals, you complain about all the horrible policies that we effectuate. He said, you have no idea how many really horrible policies we stop at the staff level. We're heroes, actually. You don't realize what heroes we are in stopping the really, in the words of this individual, batshit crazy ideas that come out of the Oval Office. Did you talk to any chiefs of staff, and you worked in the White House? How much did you draw from your own White House experience? You just did a wonderful article in the Wall Street Journal on the 5 best White House memoirs. So how much did you draw from your own experience, your own knowledge of the dynamics of a chief of staff as you wrote this book?
Well, I worked for Mr. Bush when he was vice president for 2 years. In the course of that, I started reading White House memoirs. And the first one that really sort of made me fall in love was John Ehrlichman's Witness to Power, which is, you know, it's like the great housewives staff of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. There is just some rich stuff in there. I reread it for the purposes of the Wall Street Journal piece. And, you know, there's some nuggets in there. One, possibly my favorite, was the Daniel Ellsberg has leaked the Pentagon Papers, and you know Nixon is furious, and Kissinger is not happy, and Nixon says to J. Edgar Hoover, the much feared, even by Nixon, head of the FBI, you got to get to the bottom of this. I want you to investigate Ellsberg. Well, as Ehrlichman tells us, Daniel Ellsberg's father-in-law was a toy manufacturer who, at Christmas and holiday times, distributed free toys to the children of FBI agents. So Hoover loved him, and he was reluctant to do anything. And so he kept dragging his heels, and finally Nixon lost patience and turned to Eagle Crow, a young man on his staff, and said, have your people handle it. And what does Eagle Crow do? He hires E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. Well, that turned out really well. So, you know, one combs these memoirs for, you know, fascinating glimpses like that. Every White House memoir, and I won't say I've read them all, but boy, I've read a lot of them. They all have, to your point, they all have 2 themes. One, it wasn't my fault. And 2, it would have been much worse if I hadn't been there. So, you know, I'm sure the most, to me, this Wall Street Journal piece that you alluded to on Saturday, I nominate my 5 favorite White House memoirs, and the one that really I think struck me most was one called Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years at the White House, by an Elizabeth Keckley, who was Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker. And she wrote this book in 1868. It was published, and Robert Todd Lincoln immediately suppressed it. Because, I mean, here was a book by a tradesperson, a servant, of color no less, providing intimate details about his parents' life. By intimate, I don't mean, obviously, you know, that kind of intimate, but just, you know, glimpses. For instance, I mean, there were many times where she was really the only person, the other person in the room. This very dignified woman, when little Willie Lincoln died of diphtheria or typhus fever, whatever it was, his mother, Mary Todd Lincoln, just became hysterical. Now, of course, mothers become hysterical under these circumstances. Mary Todd Lincoln really went hysterical. And there's a scene in the book that Mrs. Keckley describes of poor President Lincoln taking his hysterical wife by the arm to a window at the White House and pointing out a building in the distance. It was the insane asylum, and saying to her, "Mother, if you don't stop doing this, we're going to have to put you there." Now that's an extraordinary moment, and you find it in this memoir, which is largely forgotten. But if you look hard enough, you can even find it on Amazon. It was finally republished in the early 20th century. And then there's, well, I mean, there are dozens. And I've recently read my beloved publisher, Mr. Jonathan Karp of Simon & Schuster, in his wisdom, brought out, I'm truncating a little bit here time-wise, but he brings out John Bolton's book on Monday, my book on Tuesday, and Mary Trump's book on Wednesday. I'm like a stick of chewing gum between two big courses at this meal. But anyway, so they are endlessly published.
You'll be the answer to the trivia question. What came between Bolton and Mary Trump?
Yeah, as in, who's Christopher Buckley?
Yeah,
the guy who's written a book that you cannot buy because it's selling out everywhere. That would
there you go.
Chris?
So you just mentioned the insane asylum, Chris, and there are a number of characters in your book who I think may make their way to the insane asylum. And I want to ask you about one of them in particular, one for whom I think you have it appears an exceptional amount of disdain. Before I ask you about that one character, you said a moment ago that books like these begin with a great idea before you get to that Act 3 problem. What was that great idea, or was there a moment, or was there a time in living through the times that we are living through where all of a sudden it struck you and said, wait a minute, man, I got to get back to Washington. I got to get back to political satire because this idea just came in my head?
Well, the premise of the book, it's called Make Russia Great Again, is, I mean, the premise is that it's written by this essentially innocent character, this Herb Nutterman, he was the food and beverage manager at Mar-a-Lago.
Such a cliche. I mean, isn't that just the typical path the chief of staff? You run food and beverage at a hotel chain?
Hey, I'm just going for laughs. I'm
cheap laughs.
A comic writer. But so Trump asked him to take over because no one else will be his chief of staff. And basically the goodness of this guy's heart, he says, okay, he's a likable schlub, but he's immediately, thrown into the deep end of the swamp. And he's really just trying to do his best. So he's the narrator, and as the premise is that during the last years of the Obama administration, tempora, mores, that Mr. Obama was affronted by the Russian interference in the then coming election. So he authorizes the US Cyber Command to create a computer program that it's codenamed Placid Reflux. And it's sort of a strange love doomsday kind of device. And it works autonomously. It doesn't ask permission to do things. And it's designed to, if a country interferes in one of our elections, it retaliates by interfering in its election. Now, so 2016 comes and goes. The Russians elect Donald Trump, And the computer notices that there's no retaliation. And this was actually my prompting. I kept thinking, every time after I picked up the 117th story about Russian hacking, I thought, are we doing anything about this? Now, mind you, interfering in a Russian election, the most you can really hope for is to reduce Mr. Putin's vote from 97% to 94%. But anyway, placid reflux, because there's no active retaliation by the United States, placid reflux, like the doomsday machine in Dr. Strangelove, assumes that there's been a decapitation of leadership. The chain of command has been interrupted. So it interferes. So Herb, our likable chief of staff, I shouldn't be laughing at this, it's my own book, but he gets the, Bolton character comes in and says, right, I think we've got a problem. Because, and as Dorothy Parker used to say, what fresh hell is this? And he explains what's happened. He's just had a call from Admiral Murphy at Cyber Command. And now, Herb and the Bolton character and a very likable woman who's the DCI, the head of U.S. intelligence, they're like frantic because if the president finds out about this, he's going to go nuts and cancel all U.S. intelligence operations. In fact, he's probably going to abolish all the agencies. So anyway, what placid reflux has done, and I'll just explain this and then I'll shut up, there's a Russian election and it has deposed Vladimir Putin and elected the head of the Russian Communist Party, president, who's also kind of a likable schlub, and he's he can't believe it. He's what? And his wife is calling him up, haranguing him and saying, "What have you done to us?" He said, "I didn't do anything." Anyway, sorry, shouldn't be by my own stuff. As I say, it's almost as funny as that book right behind Steve, Big Guns.
There you go again. There you go.
Although the global war on Morris was,
thank you.
That's actually still, I mean, who can choose? But I think that's still my favorite. Morris and Herb, they are really
great,
very similar. Very
great.
Actually, it occurs to me that between the two of you, we've had satire on guns and we've had satire on smoking. I mean, you guys really go where the humor is, both of you.
We cover the bases.
Yeah.
Neither one of us wants to do satire on sex, we've decided. We're just not going there.
And we can explain to our wives that it was research.
That's right. That's right. Chris, I want to ask you my final question, then Chris Riback is going to ask something, and then Natalie is going to invite people in the audience to pose their questions. I want to take slight issue with one thing you said. You talked about Colbert and Myers and Sarah Cooper, and that this is a golden age of satire. They're brilliantly funny, but their humor is of that exact moment, right? So they're doing humor in real time. What you had to do is write a book that was going to be read in the future without really understanding, particularly in a very unpredictable presidency, where things would land, what would be plausible and implausible, who would be the Democratic nominee, for example, what would happen with Russia, what would happen with impeachment. You were writing in the moment, but the book had to have some relevance when it actually went on sale months after you wrote it. So how were you able to do that?
Someone once said that satire is the, I think is the, like a cheetah running as quickly as it can in hopes of catching up with reality. In my case, it's probably more of a dog chasing a car. I don't claim to have a crystal ball. I've never quite written political satire that's almost in real time. And I worried about that because, I mean, in the book, the Democratic or the Republican convention is held in Charlotte. This seemed plausible enough before before we heard about COVID-19. The loser 1 and loser 2 was a way of hedging my bet. Mm-hmm. By not predicting, by not using actual names, but that provided perhaps an incidental comic note, because you can imagine Trump deciding, I'm never going to, the word Biden will not pass my lips. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to call him loser 1, and I'm not going to call Amy Klobuchar, Miss Klobuchar, or crazy Klobuchar, whatever epithet he would have come up with. So you can sort of sometimes stumble almost accidentally into a comic trope, but it's by and large, I will say I mean, it's not rocket science. Come on. But it has its tricky elements.
Yeah. You did have a reference to the Wuhan virus in the book, which put you ahead of the CDC, I believe.
I had a reference in I was going through the galleys in a bar in North Carolina. When I finished the book, I treated myself to a fishing trip, and this was March 7th. In Asheville, North Carolina, and I'm going over, this is the very last pass before it goes to the printer. And I had Trump does something that becomes a meme. Herb doesn't really understand the word, but so he puts quotes around words like meme. And he said it became a meme that became more viral than the Spanish flu than the Spanish influenza of 1918. And the COVID was just starting. And the copy editor very sagely wrote she said, "You sure?" So I think the Wuhan was the substitute for that.
Interesting. All right, Chris Riback, final question from us, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on Steve's point that you've written something, Chris, that is not just for the day, but for the ages and to be read later. You've also created characters who will last throughout time. There's the Fox News star Seamus Kalanithi. There's South Carolina, it turns out, is represented by Senator Squiggly Biscuit. Now, would you say a graham cracker is a type of biscuit, Chris?
I had great fun with Squiggly. He is, if you've cleverly put your finger right on my favorite guy. Okay. He is of course the great senator. He's small, but he's great, from the great state of South Carolina, where I vote, in fact. And boy, am I looking forward to vote this November 3rd. And he is, he for some reason has made the journey from calling Mr. Trump a kook, a bigot, a nut, and every other word in that particular dictionary, to likening him to Napoleon, God, what have you. I think he's described as having an adaptability that might astonish even Charles Darwin.
That's very close, but the author actually wrote, whose ability to adapt was beyond even Darwin's imagination. See how much tighter the author put it than you just did, Chris? So can I ask you, it's interesting that you said that Senator Biscuit, Squig, was your favorite, because it felt to me, and just to be clear, you state at the very top that these are fictional characters. Any resemblance to real life, it should not be misconstrued by the reader as a real person. I can't help but feel that you have a special sentiment, though, towards the son-in-law of the president, Jared Kushner, who was, quote, I don't want to say, and what a great rhetorical device that is, the I don't want to say, Jared was, I don't want to say an odd duck, very much his own person and not an easy read. He had a way of not answering your questions and staring at you. It could be unsettling. He looked like his own Madame Tussauds work. I wondered if he started every day with a facial. His permanent look of aloofness gave him an otherworldly aspect, like an extraterrestrial being who was mulling whether to annihilate Earth with the death ray that emanated from his eyes, or not. so Squiggly was your favorite and not Jared?
No, Squiggly. Squiggly. I had more fun than with Squiggly. Jared just sort of occurs in passing. There's some people you don't really even want to spend that much time with their fictional versions. But Squiggly, no, Squiggly has a big role. He goes golfing with Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump has a golf club in Virginia called Bloody Run golf course and resort, where he insists, and I'm only half making this up. He insists that one of the consequential battles of the Civil War took place on the 17th green at this. He is no historian agrees with this. In fact, no Civil War battle took place anywhere near it. And so he drags Squiggly along on these to the golf course and proposes that Squiggly, he wants to erect a statue to the Confederate, I'm sorry for laughing, to the Confederate colonel who was the hero of the Battle of Bloody Run. And, Squiggly, who has his proboscis a fathom up a certain canal of Mr. Trump for, strategic and tactical purposes, is just praying that Trump isn't going to ask him, as he does indeed, to come and dedicate this statue to the Confederate colonel.
Yeah, the treatment of him was just terrific throughout. I know that people are waiting, wanting to ask you questions. Natalie, do you have someone who has a question for Chris?
Absolutely. So we have a couple of questions lined up. We will go until 8 o'clock, so as many questions as we can get in. If you have a question, please look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the raise hand function. Once you click on that, it'll let me know that you have something that you'd like to ask. So our first question is going to come from Vishka Khanna. Vishka, if you can just unmute yourself, you will be good to ask your question.
Hi, it's actually Vikash.
Gosh.
Yeah, no worries. I've heard worse. First of all, it's an absolute pleasure, Christopher. I'm a huge fan of your past work. You never cease to make me laugh, and I look forward to reading this and your 20th book. I'm also a friend of your dear Uncle Jim, and I adored your father. Your dad was one of my favorite all-time.
Beloved Uncle Jimmy, a great American.
Former senator. Delighted to listen to you today. And my question is the following. It was touched upon at the beginning that your book has a kind of a strange Lovian quality to it, and you touched on that as well. You obviously had a lot of fodder to work with, real life fodder to work with this book, but I'm curious if you actively drew any inspiration from past works of political satire, such as Dr. Strangelove or other films or books from the Cold War era, thinking especially given the topic is Russia. And just as a brief adjacent question, I'm curious, how do you come up with names like Placid Reflux and the other names? They're absolutely hilarious.
The answer is slowly. there were, I'm envious of people like my late friend Christopher Hitchens. He only had to write first drafts. I suppose there are probably, he wasn't a novelist, but there was Mozart who didn't need to do corrections because he was a genius. I am not. I have to work at these. Sometimes the names come quickly, and very often those are the best. Squiggly Biscuit was just a not even a low-hanging fruit. It was a Newtonian dropped fruit. I just found him on my lap. Others take a lot more time. And also to your question, yeah, Dr. Strangelove, absolutely. To me, Dr. Strangelove is maybe this isn't quite the way to put it, but the Sistine Chapel of satire. It is, I've probably seen it, 40 times, and I hope to watch it 40 more times. And the device, this autonomous computer device, is absolutely a godchild of the doomsday weapon in that marvelous movie directed by Stanley Kubrick.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Fred. Fred, if you want to go ahead and unmute.
Fred, with us?
All right, Fred, we can come back to you. So Zachary Stamen. Zachary, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi. So you started this Q&A by talking about how much you love politicians. But it seems like, and I've read a lot of your books, it seems like you make your living skewering people who inhabit Washington, D.C. and its environs. How do you sort of square that circle? Is it hate the sin, love the sinner, or how does that work for you?
It's probably some kind of codependency. I find them I find them just fascinating. I spent, it probably has something to do with the fact that I spent 2 years at the White House watching them, often up close. I wrote possibly my most successful book was a book called Thank You for Smoking. And that was about a lobbyist, a tobacco lobbyist. I sort of decided it would be fun to try to, depict a tobacco lobbyist sympathetically. If you want a challenge, try that one. And it seems to have worked. He's not a politician, but he lives in a political world. I don't know, it may be, Zachary, I have no better answer for you than it's the milieu, the political milieu is the one in which, in a way, I came of age as a writer. And it's one that that I seem to return to. The two historical novels that I wrote during my retirement from political satire, one was set in the Holy Roman Empire, the other was set in the court of Charles II. But a lot of the reviews said that, well, Buckley hasn't really given up satire. He's political satire. He's just transposed it to a different era. And, maybe that's true.
All right, Fred, if you want to give it one more shot, Fred should chat. Do you want to unmute? No, all right.
I see a question from Laura Gillen. I don't know whether she wants to ask it or whether we can just refer to it in the chat room. Can we try her?
Yes, Laura, do you want to do the raise hand function?
Well, you know what? Let me ask on her behalf because I see it in the chat room and I think it's an important question. She asks, Chris, what have you found to be the key elements to writing powerful and effective satire? So what do you need? What elements do you need in order to write a convincing satire?
Well, it's an interesting question. I suppose you need good material. I suppose you need some, I won't say a moral, because I'm I'm not particularly moral or moralist. Maybe that's the way to put it. But I think you need satire is, I think, you know, perhaps by definition, it attempts to be corrective. Jonathan Swift, the great satirist, author of Gulliver's Travels, A Tale in a Tub, and A Modest Proposal. Remember, his definition of satire was that mirror in which we see every reflection but our own. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm not answering your question very well, Laura, but there needs to be some, perhaps some kind of cleansing effect. I will avoid the word enema, but you know, a good purge. You know, I think satire is sort of can be tantamount to a good purge. Take Dr. Strangelove, the movie I referred to. Dr. Strangelove came out in January of 1964. By the way, it had its first screening, you know, those sneak previews, on November 22nd, 1963. An interesting day. And in fact, in the movie, in the scene where Colonel Kong, Slim Pickens, is going through the survival kit for the crew, he's enumerating all the things that are in the survival kit. He's saying, you know, one 45 caliber sidearm, one combination Russian Bible and phrase book, 100 Russian rubles, one pair of nylon stockings. And he goes, shoot, the fella could have himself a pretty good weekend in Vegas with all this. The original line was Dallas. Right. And they redubbed it because of that. Now, why did I mention Dr. Strangelove again? Well, just that it came out, here's a movie that makes fun. I'm wildly simplifying here, but it makes fun of nuclear war. Remember, the subtitle is, it's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. 2 years before this movie came out, actually a year and a half before it came out, the world came close to being annihilated during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So some probably would have said when Stanley Kubrick set out to do this movie, are you nuts? You find this funny? The answer is yes. The satirist finds it funny, and by virtue of finding it funny, tries to make that horror perhaps less plausible or less thinkable. I don't know. I'm speaking very grandly here.
Interesting. Before we go to our next question, Failsafe came out at about the same time as Strangelove.
That's right.
Well, what a contrast. Serious film, right?
What a contrast.
At almost
Sidney Lumet, who directed Failsafe, said, it came out slightly before Strangelove, and he was quoted somewhere as saying, thank God. Right. Failsafe came out first, because it would have.
5 more minutes. Natalie, you want to get in some more additional questions, please?
Yeah, our next question comes from Christopher Lowe. Mr. Lowe, if you can unmute yourself, please.
Hi. This is actually Chris and his wife Bonnie Dat, and Bonnie has the question. Hi, Steve. How are you?
Good. Glad you're on.
We bonded on one of our earliest dates over your writing. We're big fans. My question, actually, and I hope you didn't address this because unfortunately we got here a little bit late, is despite being a huge Democrat, I grew up in a Republican family, and we, to this day, big admirer of your father's. And there are many times over the last couple of years where I have wondered what he would think of this Republican Party and how he would be, what you think he would be doing right now if he might be a Lincoln Republican, or how he would be responding to what's going on.
Well, the glib answer would be spinning in his grave. It's tricky channeling your dad. I sit 10 feet from where he launched National Review and the modern conservative movement, and 10 feet from where he died. So every day I go to work in a study that humbles me to think what happened here. It's tricky channeling your father's ghost. You'll recall that Hamlet tried that, and you saw how that turned out. Everyone was dead by Act 5. He was asked toward the end of his life what he thought of the modern conservative movement. But this did not apply to Trump, because Trump is not part of any movement, as I mentioned earlier. But he replied in a very William F. Buckley way. He said that he thought it was in need of repristination. Only he would, he still sends us scurrying to the dictionary. I like to think he would be, so I'm speaking for myself, with perhaps some, reasonable accuracy. I think he would be appalled by the Trump administration. I think he would be appalled by the cruelty, the coarseness, the divisiveness, the narcissism, all of it. What would he make of the Republican Senate, which to me has been a profile in lack of courage, with the amazing exception of Mitt Romney, who maybe we should have looked a little more closely at last time around. I think it's become a rogues gallery, and I hate saying that, because it was once a party that I loved. I'm now a Democrat. I will probably never vote Republican again. Of course, that's mostly due to Steve Israel's mentoring, which But no, I'm very, very discouraged, and I don't know what the future holds. I don't know how you rebuild from this kind of wreckage. The Republican Party, once the party of, yes, Abraham Lincoln, has become really a cult of personality, and what a personality.
Exactly. Do we have time for one more question before we close, Natalie?
If you have a couple more minutes, Mr. Buckley, we do have another question lined up.
Sure.
All right, so we'll close with Jay Sikora. Jay, if you want to unmute, please.
Hi, so my question is how you decided which characters, like Priebus and Mary Madeline and James Carville, to mention by their real names, which ones, like Jorid and Ivanka and Kalonity, to refer to with slightly altered versions, and which ones, like Squiggly Biscuit and Kellyanne and George Conway characters, to give completely new names to, and which ones to make up out of whole cloth?
Good question. I think if again, as I say, as a hack novelist, I'm going for jokes here. And if you can make someone funnier by changing their name, I'm there. I think most people who have more than brief cameo parts, as it were, I think their names have been changed. The vice president, for instance, Vice President Pants, P-A-N-T-S. There was probably no need to change his name, but it just sounded funnier. So there. I hope that answers your question. I will say that coming up with names is one of the, there's not much writing. I find writing hard, and I bet Steve will second me on that. So there's not much. People say, "Oh, it must be fun writing this novel." It's just, are you kidding? It's horrible. It's awful. You bash your head against the laptop until blood forms. But one of the pleasures, I will say, is coming up with fun names. Dickens was the master of this, to such a degree that we now have it. His naming became an eponym. One refers to Dickensian characters. I don't think I'll reach that level, but I'm trying.
Chris Riback, final comments?
Yes, my final comment, which will be understandable to anyone who has had the privilege of reading the book and to anyone who ends up reading it. Chris, I can only say about this conversation that the optics were highly questionable, but we are going to have to leave it here for now.
I got a letter, an email over the transom through my website from an optometrist named Tom Funk. And he said, I've been waiting all my life for someone to refer to what I do in a novel. And you did. And it gave me the greatest pleasure. Anyway, I'm glad the optics certainly worked for me, and the audio worked for me. And it was a pleasure to be in the company of two such well-read gentlemen.
Well, folks, again, make Russia great again. Please get it as soon as you can. It's so wonderful to hear that satire is doing well, that the book is doing well. Christopher, above all, thank you for making us laugh in some pretty serious times. And we hope you'll come back again one day very soon.
And thank you for your service.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Bye-bye, everybody. Join us again, www.iopga.cornell.edu. Thanks. Bye-bye.